Hello, Xander.
Hello, Kevin. Good morning.
One of the things that people often don't understand when we're teaching the technique is that what is understanding the relationship between new conceptions and a new mechanical understanding, and then the movements and the actions someone can do. So, can you give an example or explain how having a new conception of the mechanical, uh, of how the different mechanisms function together, how can that then relate to suddenly a new set of movements that weren't possible before?
Yes, and it's like a continuation of our last interview, where we discussed these ideas that Alexander is joining together in his re-education technique, and these two actions: the increasing of the thoracic capacity and the lengthening of the spine. So. Um, Well, let's start very simply by having a look back. So that's it. That's this idea that there are two actions apparently. One is the reeducation of the kinesthetic system. Kinesthetic, for many people, is a strange word, and kine is the movements, and aesthesia is the perception. So that we have system of perception of movements. And this system of perception of movements are, according to Alexander, imperfect. We do not perceive exactly the movements we are making that are producing what we call the effect, what are producing the result, the end we call the posture. And so Alexander is talking about two actions: the reeducation of the system of guidance of movements and the increasing of the thoracic capacity, which for him applies a mechanical power by means of the muscle and ribs to the straightening of the spine. And these are both aspects of one central idea and are not separate and divisible acts. So ideas, acts, how do you translate an idea into an act? I think everything is contained in this little strange sentence. So during our last session, we discussed this business of increasing the thoracic capacity. So we had the drawing, the model of a boat, where Alexander explained that the ribs of the rib cage are maintained apart, held apart by muscular tissues. And it was necessary for me to start to explain the mechanism which makes that sentence work, which is that there are muscles that are increasing the thoracic capacity. We see them in action in inspiratory actions, but there is a big caveat to that. I will explain in a minute. And of course, Alexander is talking about expanding the thoracic capacity, but it's absolutely important, fundamental, to understand that for Alexander, the increasing the thoracic capacity is not primarily a respiratory goal, or it's not for him part of what we would call the respiratory function. Expanding the thoracic capacity is for Alexander at first a postural function. That is, he considers that the rib cage, the ribs, the muscle in between the ribs, or the muscles that are involved in respiratory action are at first muscles that have a different function, and a function that is postural. We are not for the moment looking at expanding the thoracic capacity as a function of breathing. It could be helpful at some moment to ask the student to perform what we will see is a deep breath, a very, very large inspiratory act, in order for the pupil to discover the expansion of the rib cage, because I maintain that this muscular tissue, analogous to the board of a boat, which should maintain the free end of the ribs close apart and not close together, are in most of my pupils and students at first not working. So I have chosen an image of a student while he's working with me online, and this is what we see as sitting posture. And of course, we must suspect that the person is more or less breathing, because the person is alive. And but the first difficulty we are faced with is not a breathing difficulty. We are faced with fatigue in sitting, with difficulty in maintaining attention because of fatigue, because of tiredness, and breathing is only secondary. So it is seen that great force is applied onto the ribs because of postural support. The person has no intention of applying great force on the ribs and to have them buckle, yeah? But we see that there are different movements of the parts of the rib cage, therefore of the ribs, which are involved in supporting the self. Increasing the thoracic capacity in this case is a must from the first lesson onward, because without the increase on the thoracic capacity, the primary function of support is not working. So we are going to look at this image, and we are going to look at the description. So we have the first here, the upper chest is unduly raised, and in most cases the shoulders also. We will see that, of course, the upper part of the rib cage, as you can see, the sternum is totally inclined backward at the top. As a result, we can see that the belly or middle torso is forward of the head. The head is not forward of the self. And that is due to the fact that when the upper rib cage is held backward, well, the thoracic spine is pushed back, which means that the cervical spine is held so far back from the front that the only way to get the head forward is to collapse downward. And as you will see, with this unduly raised sternum bone, there are collapsed ribs. We are going to explore this kind of representation of the mechanism, where we have on the right, the same image. I have taken, you see, this image, and I have added to it what we can see. That is that there is a sternum bone in two parts. A sternum, of course, and a manubrium. They are articulated with two ribs, the first and second rib, which are themselves attached to the first and second thoracic vertebrae. It is, well, obvious that there is a certain direction for the sternum. That direction is obtained as a result of a series of movements. It's necessary to obtain this kind of unduly lifted sternum. It's absolutely necessary to have one movement that is sending the middle torso forward and one movement of the upper torso and shoulders backward. Therefore, the person is seen wearing the shoulder much further back than the middle torso. The shoulders are much further back than the lowest ribs. The lowest ribs, as you see, have been sent forward. From that picture, you can already imagine that, yes, the rib cage is rotated. There is a rotation of the rib cage object such that the top of the rib cage is very far back, the lower part of the rib cage is very far forward. The second point that Alexander is making is that the back is unduly hollowed in the lumbar region. Well, if you look at it, yes, there is a hollow in the back, which means that the upper torso is very much further back than the back of the middle torso. The person is hollowing the ribs. And the lowest ribs, which we'll see are very important to expand the thoracic capacity, are moving forward with the ribs, with the vertebrae. So the unduly lifted chest, the hollowed back, and we will see the consequence of these two facts, which results from the same series of movement, is that the abdomen is generally protruded, and there is an abnormally deranged intra-abdominal pressure. Yes, you see the abdomen is protruded, the abdomen is in front of the shoulders, the abdomen is in front of the top of the chest, the abdomen is even in front of the head. You must understand that the muscle of the chest, of course, are not respiratory. That their primary function is not respiratory. But the muscle of the abdomen, their primary function is not respiratory, but they are very much involved in the efficiency of the respiratory system. We know that when the abdomen is protruding, there is no support for the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a muscle that is attached to the lower sternum and the frontal margin of the ribs, and attached on the other side to, the middle lumbar vertebrae. So you can imagine a very large dome. Most people have a wrong idea about the dome. They think that the function of the muscle of that dome is, of course, to get active at the moment of inspiration by, of course, shortening the fibers and bringing the top of the dome downward to expand, the space within the upper rib cage. It's a wrong conception. The right conception is that there should be an opposition to the movement of the dome downwards for two reasons. The first one being that if there is no opposition, like in this case, there cannot be any opposition, because the opposition to the movement of the dome is, in fact, the movement of the abdomen backward that is pushing the abdominal cavity, that is incompressible, against, that dome. What would be the effect of this? The effect of it would be an increase in inspiratory efficiency, because if the abdomen is moving back when, against the downward movement of the diaphragm dome, what will happen is that the fibers of the diaphragm are going to be suspended from above, and that their tendency of activation is to shorten. Instead of pushing the abdomen down, they are going to raise the ribs. The primary function of the diaphragm is to expand the upper torso, and its function only works in combination, in, working with the abdominal muscles, so that therefore when the dome is starting to compress against the abdominal mass, what happens is that not only are the ribs going to be lifted, but also it will make sure that the fibers of the diaphragm are going to work at a great length. The working length is essential for mechanical advantage. If you try to obtain the strongest pull possible with the least activation, it's necessary to maintain the muscle at its longest length, longest dimension. Therefore, when the abdomen is going backward, against the movement of the diaphragm going down, we maintain the minimal activation for the fibers of the diaphragm and the maximal action. Therefore, the raising of the rib cage is going to be maximal. when the abdomen is not forward, which is absolutely impossible in this case, because in this case, as you can see, there is no way the diaphragm can work properly. Well, the first reason is that the diaphragm is attached to the middle lumbar region, and if the middle lumbar region is going forward toward the sternum, well, the diaphragm is going to be already short before any idea of breathing. And this muscle, like the diaphragm, is always thought as a respiratory muscle. It's quite interesting to know that scientists have discovered that the maximal activation of the diaphragm is never for breathing. It's for two actions that are not associated with breathing immediately in your mind. One is carrying heavy objects. So carrying heavy object is, of course, active support. When you are carrying something real heavy to protect your back, you're going to really use the diaphragm muscle. You really want to create some sort of resistance in the rib cage to help, well, the spine not to buckle. And so the second one is when you are vomiting or defecating or trying to expel something, that's when the maximum activation of the diaphragm is found. In breathing and in deep breathing, you never find that activation of the diaphragm. What is important is to understand that in breathing, we are talking of a repetitive activity, and therefore a minimalist solution is always the best. So in this case, we see that the head is thrown too far back, the neck unduly tensed and shortened at a time when it should be perfectly free of strain. Why are we saying that the neck is tense? Well, because it's held so far back. And the many muscles of the neck are shortened. When we say that the shoulders are lifted, you must understand that the trapezius muscle, which is the main part of the back of the neck, is also the muscle that lift the shoulders. In sitting, that student is maintaining his shoulder very, very high and backward. Therefore, what I wanted to stress is that all these spots, these dots that we are following, A, B, C, D, E, are all occurring at the same time. It's not because the upper chest is unduly raised or because the back is unduly lowered that all this is happening. All these factors are contributing to the picture we are discussing at the moment. And part of this picture is quite interesting, is that Alexander considers expansion not in parts. He says that parts of the chest are unduly expanded, while others that should share in the expansion are contracted, particularly the back of the lumbar region. And so we are back to our vision, where if of course, you shorten the back and throw the middle torso forward, the action of the spine is going to narrow the distance between the free end of the ribs. This is exactly what we are seeing here. Instead of having a long curve between the front of the ribs, we see nearly a straight line. So that is what Alexander considers as a part of the chest unduly expanded. They are, there are here a contraction, and you must understand that this shortening of the back of the spine is communicated to the lower ribs and to the back of the lower ribs particularly. So you can have too much expansion in one zone and too little in another, which is, well, quite sensible. So we start the lesson by explaining a conception of the working of the mechanism. we start with this idea that not only are the front of the three ribs of the lower end of the rib cage too close together, it's also the case at the top. I'm explaining to the pupil that the sternum is connected with the spine with bony arcs, the ribs, and therefore to obtain that sort of posture, it's necessary, of course, to draw the upper sternum backward relatively to the middle sternum, but that can only occur if the front and the ribs of the ribs are collapsed together. As you can see, the free end of the upper ribs have been drawn back and down. They have to go back and down, otherwise it could be impossible to draw the sternum so far back. The enormous pressure has been inflicted upon, well, the mechanism of the torso by the postural response to sitting upright. And so when you start to have that representation of the mechanism, it's possible suddenly to imagine. So I have set in front of that picture a different position of the different parts. So we can see that on the left this time, the reeducated or readjusted mechanism is such that, well, the upper torso, instead of being backward of the middle torso, has been moved forward. So instead of having a straight back, we start to see a straight sternum. The sternum is no more inclined backward in the upright position. As a result, you must understand, due to the length of the ribs, the spine has moved or has been moved. It's necessary to understand that to obtain a straight sternum position, it's necessary to move the vertebrae. And so the relationship between the top vertebrae and the top thoracic vertebrae and the middle lumbar vertebrae has totally changed. On the left, I talk about straight back, because if you were to draw a line from the middle lumbar region to the top of the cervical, of the thoracic region, you will see something nearly a line. It's as if that person is trying to get his back above the middle of his torso, the middle of the support. Well, as you can see, we can imagine something totally different. And in this case, well, of course, the rotation, if it happens around the lower sternum spot, should bring the extremity, the top extremity, slightly further forward and upward, because we are discussing the rotation of an arc. As the primary position, the starting position is backward relatively to the center of rotation, we must expect some movement upward. And so there should be a movement upward, but there should be a movement forward and upward of the upper ribs. For the moment, these movements seems completely impossible, but we will see that the pupil can start exploring this situation and discovering that the expansion of the rib cage is, well, totally linked with the lengthening of the spine we are discussing. So this is how the lesson starts, and from there we start exploring technical tools. You would call them intellectual tools that the pupil can make use of in order to change his way of organizing the movement of the different parts. So here we start. There are different indications. One is the pupil is setting his finger on the lower sternum. So we are locating the lower sternum in space. And as you can see, I've requested the student to take all of the tissue of the t-shirt at the height of the lowest ribs. We are starting to imagine what it would mean to lengthen the distance between the free end of the ribs. I'm not asking the pupil to breathe. I'm not mentioning breathing. We are just imagining that it could be possible to expand the rib cage by having the lowest ribs go back in space, away from the lower part of the sternum. And we are going to explore what happens when this movement is engaged. Of course, the pupil is not holding the tissue in between the ribs. But we can ask the pupil to start moving the ribs, the lower ribs, in such a way as making sure that the hands that is touching the ribs is following the course. Therefore, the pupil is going to start to, well, explore. First of all, explore wrong movements. Let me explain. At first, when the pupil is going to start moving the ribs backward, there's going to be a distinct pull of the lower sternum downward. The pupil is so intent in doing the movement at that moment that it is absolutely possible that the pupil will not see or feel anything untoward. But as these sessions are filmed, we can always come back and discover that yes, there is a tendency when one is pulling the lowest ribs or directing the movement of the lowest ribs backward, there is a tendency for the upper sternum to follow suit, to go in the same direction. And so it's necessary from the start to establish an antagonism. That's why the pupil is not solely pointing at the sternum. The pupil is holding the t-shirt at the height of the sternum. And the idea is to create antagonistic pulls on the t-shirt. So the pupil has to command, or you would say order, these movements. That means he has to start pulling on both extremities at the same time. And he's doing that at a count of 3. That is, when he says 1, he will start pulling on both extremities. When he says 2, it will be, well, the half of the movement, the middle part of the movement. And when he says 3, he should stop pulling with both hands. At first, it's necessary to use mechanical actions as if we are using the t-shirt as an object that can be stretched, that will help the pupil understand what it is to command simultaneous action. And from that action that is done on something outside of the self, the pupil will start being capable of directing antagonistic action with parts of the self. And so we can observe what is happening when the pupil is starting to expand the rib cage. So for the moment, as you can see, you can observe that the right fist has gone down. It should not. It should have stayed upward. So this is necessary for the pupil to realize that there are movements that are necessary. There are movements that we want to see. But there are also movements that we don't want to see happen next time in the process. So we want to see whether the pupil can start again with the same procedure, but knowing what has happened before. We want the pupil to see whether he can prevent the wrong movement from happening when the correct readjustments, when the correct readjusting movements are performed. It's a fantastic tool where the pupil is going to start monitoring his activity in retrospect, using prevention as the main tool. And so when the pupil is performing this movement, it's also possible to have him realize that when we compare the two movements, there are movements that are unwanted. It's seen that the shoulders are going up in space. Can you see that the shoulder is going up in space when the pupil is supposed to pull the lowest ribs backward? And that tendency of lifting the shoulder blades, obviously the shoulder blades are not lifted in the forward direction. As you can see, they are lifted in the backward direction. So this raises a question for the pupil. Well, I need to raise the question for the pupil, in fact, which is that is it a natural movement? Is it something you can't do anything about it? That is, when you are moving the ribs to move the hand back, is it necessary that the elbow and shoulder should go back? Could we start questioning this and imagine that there could be another possibility? The other possibility being that when they, of course, the ribs are moving back and allowing the hand to go back, could it be possible to direct, of course, the elbow and shoulder forward? There is a reason for that question. The reason for that question is that at the moment, when the pupil is starting to pull the lowest ribs backward, there is a tendency that is preventing the upper rib cage from rotating forward. Look at what is proposed. When the pupil is going to start pulling the lowest ribs backward, while the lower sternum is not going with it. That means that the lower sternum is not going down, as I said before, but also that the lower sternum is not going back. And at the moment, it's more or less what is happening. So if you take an object, a sort of, rectangle object like the rib cage, and you start maintaining the front of the object in place while the lower part is going back. If I ask, very often, I ask the pupil to take hold of a rectangle like a book, maintaining the book on the front center, and then starting to move the lower part of the book in a direction that I will call backward. Well, immediately you will see that the top part of the book is going to rotate relatively to the fixed point. In this case, it's nearly not happening. Well, there is a small tendency, if you look closely, a small tendency to go up. There is not only the shoulders that are going up. We could say that the shoulders are going up because if you look at the height of the vertebrae, they have a tendency to go up. But they are not going forward. That's absolutely obvious. So there is, a restraint. The pupil is resisting the movement forward and upward of the rib cage. Well, it's necessary for the pupil to realize this, because if the pupil does not realize it, there is no way. If the pupil does not see the wrong movements that are occurring as a result of his readjustment, as his reason and deliberate readjustment, there is no way forward. The pupil will think he's doing the right thing when in fact he's not. It's absolutely necessary to understand which are the movements that are absolutely obviously going in the right direction, but it's also necessary, and even more, to understand which are the movements we don't want to see. And in this case, this is what is happening. You will see also that there is a red line that appears in most of the images, and at the moment this red line is what we call the temple line direction. The temple is a word that comes from temporal. The temporal bone is the bone of your ear, and the bone that is linked with the suborbital ridge. There is a ridge beneath the bone of your eye, and if you link that ridge on the orbital bone with your ear, you get a line. And that line, more or less, is represented here by the temple. The temple is the name of the arm of the glasses the person is wearing. So what we notice is that every time the person is rotating the torso, making an attempt at rotating the torso, maybe the pupil does not realize that getting the lowest ribs back and the lower sternum not is a rotation of the torso, but it's a case, it's a fact, that's a rotation. Every time the pupil starts of this idea of rotating the torso, there is a movement that happens every single time. Every single time you see the temple line collapsing at the front, or going downward at the front. It's very, very interesting. Just the idea of rotating, just discussing a sort of schematic model where the torso or the upper rib cage is rotating forward, I swear, it's sufficient to, see a movement of the head in anticipation or in response to the idea. That movement is clearly stimulated by thinking of rotating the rib cage. Again, it's something we need to discuss with the pupil. Is it when you think of rotating the rib cage, and well, of course, when you rotate the rib cage, is it necessary that the head should go forward and down? Well, the answer can be met by experiments. The experiments can be just, we can just say, when I am going to think of rotating the rib cage, I will think of lifting the front of the temple line. At the moment, it's not. At the moment, it's not working or not part of the experiment. But this is going to be the second aspect: is that we are going to discover that the shoulders are raised and the temple line is dropped when the lowest ribs are rotating. So we see that these movements are interlinked. Pupil can start and see whether it could be possible to go against the habit by having a clear intent. Well, a clear organization of the intentions of movements. So we can start thinking, okay, we have covered some ground. We are going to continue with the basic rotation of the rib cage, but now with this basic rotation of the rib cage, we want to see whether the elbow and the shoulders can go forward and not back, whether they can go down and not up, and whether we can accept to move forward with the temple line but not downward. You must imagine that the mind of the student is starting to boil. We are discussing many movements at the same time, and this is not something anybody has been accustomed to. We were discussing earlier with Kevin about this. Many people are doing movements, yoga teachers, somatic teachers, gymnastics people or running people, but discussing coordinated intentions of movements at once, it's something that people are not trained for. So we just need to take our time and accept what is going to happen. At first, what is going to happen is very little, and it's only after a lot of efforts that we can. You see that we've discussed a possibility of having a vertical sternum. The pupil has done all it could, but still we can see that the wrong movements are happening with the temple line, and the wrong movements also has a tendency to happen, and there is a new line. You know, I have written here a new line. You see the lower sternum, and you see that, well, you don't see, but there is a spot just behind the ear, just behind the temporal bone. The lower part of the temporal bone is a sort of protuberance that is called the mastoid. You must have heard of it because there is a very well-known muscle which is called the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Sterno for sternum, cleido for clavicle, and mastoid for mastoid process just behind the ear. So it's easy for the pupil to use well, straight ruler, a wooden stick, and we just want to assess, consciously control what is the habitual direction of that line. Well, of course, the line does not exist until the pupil is using some objective tool to represent it. But once the pupil has represented the line with the tool, the line, we would say, is conceived. The person has suddenly a line that does not exist. Nobody is thinking about the lower sternum and the mastoid process below the ear. But now the pupil can start to have an intention that is a bit clearer. That is when, as you see, the left hand is placed on the lower rib cage, we have now an idea to relate the movement of the rib cage and stop the movement of pulling the head back. The pupil is starting to see that his head is always backward relatively to the lower sternum. It's the pupil, you would say, as a new conception, the pupil can start to see in his own mind what is his habitual use of the different parts of the mechanism, what is the result of that use, and what new use could lead to a new result, more in line. So more in line where you would have here the temporal line is much more vertical, and now we want to see whether it could be possible to maintain the temporal line horizontal while the sternomastoid line is in fact readjusted. So it's just what we want to see and the pupil want to see. And so for the moment, what we see is that the pupil is, yes, starting to readjust. So there is no question that the lowest ribs are going back. The pupil will see that the protruding abdomen is, well, much less in view. So it's possible to start to imagine that we could expand the line of the free ribs, free end of the ribs at the lower part. For the moment, that is what is happening. And we discover that when that part of the rib cage is expanding, well, there is a collapse of the upper rib cage. That is, when we go back to the diagram, the conception, we can see that we are, in fact, asking for a new rotation. While the rib cage is rotating around a center, could it be possible to rotate the upper ribs around a different center at the back of the upper spine? Could it be possible to have, when the movement forward is engaged, we can imagine that the top of the ribs is going to move forward. Could it be possible to accelerate the front of the ribs? If the top of the ribs are moving forward faster than the free end, well, in geometry, that means that the free end are going down. And this is exactly what is happening when the person is starting to direct. This is already a movement when the person is directing. We can see that from the start, the lowest, the free end of the upper ribs are much slower than the vertebrae at the top of the thoracic wall. Therefore, there is a collapse downward. There is a shortening of the sternocleidomastoidean. But that shortening is not sufficient to get the temporal line up. So we observe how the person is reacting. We observe what could be the new orientation. So we are discussing so many movements at once that at first you must understand that when the pupil is thinking of something, is forgetting something else. It's absolutely logical. At the moment, the capacity of attention of the person is a bit restricted. And on top, you must understand that when a person is used to sitting like this, when you arrive at that kind of readjustment, you must understand that the person is feeling absolutely wrong. The person has the impression to be much too far forward. There is a stretch at the back that is massive. The lengthening of the back is creating all sorts of strange feelings. The shoulders have now gone very, very far forward. The widening of the back is massive. So this is not the perfect conditions to be capable to calmly reason about 6 movements going on at the same time. Well, it's just, but you must understand also that it's just a condition. It just needs some practice of organizing a series of ideas when feeling the most. That is becoming capable, even when the feelings are absolutely horrendous, are absolutely strange, that it becomes possible to think of more and more things at once. And you will see that the pupil is starting, well, at the moment, the pupil is starting to, now that the movement of the lower rib cage is engaged, we see that the pupil, without the use of any tools, without the use of the tissue of the middle torso t-shirt, the pupil is now starting to, well, have the back go back, the middle back is going back, the lowest ribs are starting to be, well, directed very far backward. We can see that the back is widening, not only at the top now, but in the middle. Well, now that this is possible, I'm requesting the pupil to create a mechanical action on the upper torso, asking the pupil to direct the movement forward with, well, with all his resolve. So that now his hands and elbows and shoulders are all involved into a new action, which is to bring the upper part of the arm forward. Yes. And we see that there is a tendency for the temple line to go much less downward. Of course, it's not yet horizontal, but for the upper torso to be as far upright and the temple lines to be up, you must understand that the root of the tongue muscle, that all the muscles that are connecting the chin and ear to the larynx, and the larynx to the sternum and to the shoulders would have to stretch massively. At the moment, the student is just discovering these new movements. Is discovering this new movement that is performing by himself, and I maintain that this is only possible because the student has a sort of model in mind. The conception of the movement is primary. If you do not give your pupil this indication as to how the mechanism's movement can be organized reasonably, there is no way in one lesson you can go from one understanding of what it is to support the torso in sitting and another. You will realize that the pupil does not look really at rest. You know, it shows that the pupil, in order to produce these movements against all his habit of life, it's absolutely necessary to engage actions, to engage activity. And we are coming to a new idea, is that expanding the thoracic cage is a result of actions. Alexander considers that there is a lack of action. The main problem we are faced, and that's why deep breathing is going to be a subject for us. Because Alexander considers that deep breathing is indeed a step in the right direction. It's only a step because it does not always do serious harm, and in a certain instant perhaps a certain amount of good. That is what we are going to explore. Well, of course, it does not go to the root of the matter, the eradication of defects. Nor does it take cognizance of the most important factor in the scheme of physical coordination. Well, what is the most important factor in the scheme of physical coordination? If you remember, we have already discussed that sentence. And the most important factor is the eradication of defects. And these defects appear when the person is starting to readjust. When the person is starting to readjust, we can see that the person has a tendency to bring the shoulders back because he's moving one part of the rib cage back. All the parts of the rib cage are more or less going back. So that's a defect that has to be eradicated. When the pupil is starting to rotate the rib cage, of course, there is a lifting of the back. And when the pupils lift the back, there is a tendency to lift the shoulders. It is another defect that has to be eradicated. And also we see that when the person is starting to rotate the rib cage so that it's going forward and up, there is an associated movement that at first is absolutely impossible to suppress, and that is to drop the nose down. As you will see, of course, when the ear spot is accelerated forward as a result of the rotation of the spine. The chin is not activated forward, is staying forward, staying down. Therefore, the rotation of the head is always a rotation forward and down. At first, Alexander was complaining in the use of the cell that everything he tried to lengthen the back would be associated with the head being directed forward and down, never forward and up. That is what we are going to discuss here. Yes, nevertheless, it's a step in the right direction. And for us, I could replace deep breathing with, of course, we know that taking a deep breath is associated with the inspiratory motions of expansion. We have to discover what it is to expand the chest. We have to discover what it is to, of course, lift the chest. Despite the back publicity there is about lifting the chest in the Alexander Technique old world, we must understand that there is a need to expand the ribs. And this is a motion that in most people, we have the act of breathing as a secondary part of the process, but in most people, it's very, very difficult to elicitate any expansion in inspiratory functions. There is a collapse of the respiratory function, and I was looking for a quote. This is going to be for next time, where Alexander really explains that the increasing of the thoracic capacity is at first impossible to trigger in most individuals because of the flabby, the fact that there is an harmful indulgence in habits of posture, and the normal condition of vigor in the action of the component part of the respiratory mechanism is greatly interfered with. He says a general nervous relaxation is brought about, and a feeble, flabby action becomes permanent. So many students I've met have told me the same story. The story that the difficulty with breathing that we are, all of us, we have difficulty breathing that is established. So we are all experiencing these kind of things, and very often the explanation is that the rib cage muscles are too active. There is a tightness in the rib cage. When you watch person sitting, I don't see the tightness in the rib cage as a result of overaction of the respiratory muscles, so-called respiratory muscles. You must understand that we have the feeble, flabby action that has become permanent. So it's not by releasing that person is going to reintegrate the true expansion of the rib cage. The performance of the expansion motions cannot be obtained by releasing, and even less by releasing by lying down on the floor or on the table. It's going to be necessary for that person to start to think in terms of movements, in terms of visible movements. Can we see the ribs, free ends moving apart from each other? This is going to be a question for our next interview. Any comment or question?
Where does when you're teaching this to the person, how much detail do you give them in advance of giving them experiments to do? So you showed the images of the boat earlier, and the Alexander's analogy of the slats in the boat. So can you explain to people who've maybe not had a lesson with you how much detail you give of each of creating a new conception of the movements for the person in advance of then giving them some movement experiments to do that enact the new understanding or test the new understanding?
Evidently, there are phases. It's necessary for the pupil to start first of all understanding the words and relating the words with concrete objects. So when I start discussing the rib cage, we need to have a very clear understanding, and I say we need to share, the student and myself, or the pupil and myself, we need to share a common understanding. So we are going to go through different phases. For example, we are going to locate I'm going to ask the pupil to locate where is the highest point of the rib cage in his organism. So this is going to be an exploration. We are going to discuss whether we agree. When we have the top of the rib cage, we'll have the front of the rib cage, the back of the rib cage to discuss also, and see what the spots we are discussing are real, are physical, but they have to be represented. For example, when we consider the whole of the rib cage, we have the top and the bottom. We need to think about both. So, of course, with your fingers, you can touch the top and the bottom. When we start to discuss the depth and the width, well, you have not enough fingers to touch them all at the same time. So it's necessary for the person then to start to use tools like representation. So I do show a lot of diagrams beforehand for the person to start to understand what are the difficulties and the problems we are discussing. Then we start getting one step ahead. The first step is like the spots of, for example, a rib cage object. We can have different spots and we represent these spots. Then the second part is discussing lines. It's possible to, with two spots, make a line. And when we are discussing, for example, the sternomastoid line, I'm going to have the pupil understand what I mean by sternomastoid line, where it is situated as a result of the movement the person is doing most of the time without realizing it, when the person is sitting, or when the person is standing, or when the person is passing from sitting to standing. We can discuss that, and the pupil will start to have a realization, seeing on screen himself going to stand, wearing a sternomastoid line like a ruler, and he's going to, observe what is happening. That is necessary. It's impossible to just go into a lesson and just say, well, you are going to start rotating the rib cage by having the lower sternum directed upward and the lowest ribs directed back, so that you can maintain the temple line horizontal and bring the sternomastoid line to the vertical. The person would not understand the sentence at all. It would make no sense, and it would not help the pupil. Whilst when the pupil starts to have constructed all these conceptions, has started to organize the conception together and start to anticipate what would be the resulting motions, what would be the resulting posture, and also how strange, how bizarre and painful maybe the new organization of the part can be. Well, yes, then the pupil is armed to experiment. So
there's also an in-between stage that you like to use, isn't there, where you show them the diagrams and you talk about you're helping them have a conceptual understanding of the mechanical movements or the relationships, and then before they do the actual trying to change those relationships in the physical parts of their own mechanisms, you like to use modeling. So sometimes you'll maybe use a book. You'll have them do something like physically with their hands to help them create the mental model in their mind before they move on to actually doing it with those specific parts of the rib cage or whatever it is you're working with.
Well, it's not a game. It's a real necessity. That is that when you start discussing the rotation of an object that is part of the organism of the person, the conception of the movement is totally imbued or totally springing from the habitual feeling sensation that the person has relating to that object. So if you want somebody to reason about the possible movement of a mechanism, it's necessary very often to get outside of the body and to create a small model that is, of course, not corresponding exactly with the body of the person, but that has the essential characteristic, and the person is going to make it rotate. And I'm going to ask the person, when you rotate a rectangle in this way with the front of the rectangle held in the middle and you move the lower part backward, like when we do back, what is the trajectory of the upper part of that rectangle? And the person is going to say it's going forward. And you are just asking the person, could you please hold the book again, perform the action again, and see if you want to change your statement. What? Well, yes, okay. And the person is, and so it's going forward. Yes, it's going forward. Is that all? And the person may have a tendency to tell me it's going forward and down. Aha, it's going forward and down. Is it not that we said that the middle front, which is the lower sternum part in our case, the middle front of the rectangle, should be going not down with the lowest rib? It should be resisting that movement? Yes, we said that. Why are you saying this? Because every time you're performing the rotation, I see that you're not, in fact, keeping the middle of the front of the rectangle up. You're going down with it. Let's try again, and let's be clear about the fact that you don't want the middle of the rectangle to go down, and the person will suddenly see what she was doing before, which corresponded to a conception of her own rib cage, even when we were discussing a book. And so the person then will make sure that the book is not going forward and down in the middle, and therefore when the middle of the lower part of the book is going back, the person will then rephrase and say, well, it's going, if the middle of the front is not going down, then we are going forward and up with the top of the book. It will help the person realize that when she is rotating the rib cage, she does not know at first how to rotate without going down in the front. And so the person is going to start thinking, well, yes, but when I do that, I feel really tense. Yes, you're lifting the rib cage away from the pelvis. Is that correct? Yes, I have a lot of activity in my stomach muscle. Well, they are not the stomach muscle, they are the abdominal muscles, but a lot of activity. We have to discuss that, because do you mean that you're making an effort? You need an effort of these muscles in order to rotate in this case and make you lift? I thought that if you were doing an excessive action with these abdominal muscle, it would put your rib cage downward. No, but I feel real tension. Yes? When you watch the video, do you feel that this tension, or do you see that this tension has a shortening effect or a lengthening effect? And the person will say, well, yes, I feel a tension, but it has a lengthening effect. I say, then we can leave it at that, because we have a rule. When the tension that you feel is associated with a widening or a lengthening, that the tissue is stretched, you know, this is what we call antagonistic pulls. If you feel antagonistic pulls, you're in the right place and you're doing the right adjustment, because that's what we are after. So yes, there are many levels where we need to discuss, the student or the pupil and myself, of what are the meanings of the words we use. When we say the direction of a movement, what do we mean? You know, it's not at first, when you teach, you don't realize how much evidence there is in your conceptions, that there are things that are obvious to you, and they mean something completely different for the pupil in front of you. If you don't make that effort as a teacher to go toward your pupil and to start to really become technical, that is to make sure that the word you're using refer to something that the pupil conceive, well, the pupil is not going to be able to use your lessons. He's going to receive a treatment maybe, he's going to have a few exercise, a few experience, but this is not learning. Learning is about translating, in fact, words into intentions, intentions into actions, and verifying that the actions performed and seen on camera are correspond exactly with the conception of the mechanism you had in the first place. And if not, well, continue the work.
Okay, so if anyone wants to have a go at this, you can book a lesson with Jean-Do. So you'll find a link to his email, Facebook, and website underneath this video, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks, Jean-Do.
You're welcome.